A glimpse through the shadows. The Ember Ridge rest stop was a quiet haven along a desolate stretch of interstate, an unassuming spot with a weathered diner and a few gas pumps glistening under the setting sun. As the golden light cast long shadows over the asphalt, the sound of distant cicadas merged with the hum of a cooling vending machine. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of fried food and freshly cut grass from the fields beyond. Michael Harris, a battle-hardened Marine, pulled into the lot, his battered truck crunching against loose gravel. He was on leave after a long tour overseas, heading to visit an old friend in the next state. Ember Ridge wasn't on his planned route, but after hours on the road, the flickering diner sign promising coffee and pie was too tempting to pass. Michael was a man of instincts, shaped by years of service, and although he sought the quiet peace of home, his sharp senses had never dulled. The diner was nearly empty when Michael entered. A bell jingled faintly overhead, the sound swallowed by the steady hum of fluorescent lights. A waitress behind the counter barely glanced up from her phone, while two truckers hunched over steaming cups of coffee at a corner booth. Near the window sat an elderly man, his hands trembling as he turned the pages of a crossword book. It wasn't these ordinary scenes that caught Michael's attention. It was the pair seated in the far booth by the window. A young black girl, no older than 9, sat across from a middle-aged white man. The contrast between them was stark. She wore a faded yellow hoodie, her small hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup that seemed far too big for her. Her curly hair was tied back hastily, and her large, wary eyes darted about the room like a bird scanning for predators. The man across from her, dressed in a crisp white button-up shirt, with a tie slightly loosened, leaned back casually in his seat. He stirred his coffee absently, his gaze often fixed on the girl, though his expression remained unreadable. Michael's instincts prickled. He told himself there could be many explanations, a father and daughter, an uncle taking care of his niece, but something about the girl's body language screamed discomfort. She sat stiffly, her posture too restrained for a child, her knees bouncing under the table as if she were trying to expend nervous energy. Michael ordered a coffee to go, but instead of heading back to his truck, he found a seat near the counter, giving him a clear line of sight to the booth by the window. He sipped his coffee slowly, his sharp eyes scanning the interaction. The girl kept glancing at the man, her gaze flickering down whenever he seemed to notice. Michael thought he saw her lips move once, whispering something under her breath, but he was too far to hear. The man stirred his coffee again, his movements deliberate, his focus unwavering. Something wasn't right. Michael shifted in his seat, replaying the scene in his mind. Years of combat had taught him to trust his gut, and right now, every fiber of his being was telling him this was no ordinary encounter. He watched as the girl raised her hand to adjust her hoodie. Her palm faced outward for a split second, her fingers spread wide. Michael froze. It was a gesture he had seen before, on the battlefield, during missions where communication had to be silent. A nonverbal SOS, subtle enough to escape casual notice, but unmistakable to someone trained to see it. The girl dropped her hand quickly, her small frame shrinking further into the booth. Michael's pulse quickened. If she was signaling for help, it wasn't something to ignore. He needed to tread carefully, though. Accusing a stranger of wrongdoing without evidence could escalate the situation, or worse, put the girl in greater danger. He studied the man's face, looking for signs of aggression or deceit, but the man's expression remained calm, his demeanor calculated. Michael reached for his phone but hesitated. Should he call the police now, or wait and observe longer? What if he was wrong? The man might be her guardian, and the girl's nervousness might be due to unrelated anxiety. Just as Michael was weighing his options, the man leaned forward slightly, his voice low as he spoke to the girl. Her shoulders stiffened, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Whatever he said made her flinch, her eyes darting to the door for the briefest moment before returning to the tabletop. Michael's decision was made. Setting his coffee cup down, he stood and walked toward the vending machines near the exit. positioning himself closer to the booth without appearing obvious. He feigned interest in the selection of snacks while keeping the pair in his peripheral vision. The girl raised her hand again, subtly, and made the same open palm gesture. This time, her eyes briefly met Michael's. It was all the confirmation he needed. Michael turned back to the counter, his mind racing. He approached the waitress, his voice steady but urgent. "Do you have a payphone here, or can I use your landline? My cell's dead, and I need to make a call." The waitress blinked, then nodded toward the back wall. "Payphones by the restrooms." Michael thanked her and headed for the phone. Once there, he dialed 911, keeping his voice low. "This is Michael Harris. I'm at Ember Ridge Rest Stop off Route 49. I believe a child may be in danger here. Young black girl, about 9 years old, wearing a yellow hoodie. She's with an older white man, mid-50s, clean cut. Something doesn't feel right. She signaled for help, twice. I think it might be an abduction." The operator's response was calm and measured, reassuring Michael that help was on the way. He hung up and returned to the dining area, his mind calculating his next move. If the man noticed Michael's attention, he didn't show it. But the girl, she noticed. Her wide eyes followed him as he returned to his seat by the counter, her expression a mix of fear and faint hope. Michael knew he had to buy time until law enforcement arrived. The question was how. He wasn't armed, and a direct confrontation could escalate unpredictably. He'd seen too many situations like this turn violent in the blink of an eye. He settled on a plan. Michael stood again, walking over to the booth with an air of casual friendliness. "Hey there," he said, directing his words at the man but glancing at the girl. "Sorry to bother you, but do you have the time? My phone's dead, and I don't have a watch." The man looked up, startled by the sudden interaction. His smile was thin and forced as he glanced at his wristwatch. "It's 6:15, he replied curtly. Michael nodded. "Thanks. Traveling with your daughter?" He motioned to the girl, his tone light, but probing. The man stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Yes," he said after a pause, his voice clipped. "Just grabbing dinner before we hit the road." Michael's gaze lingered on the girl, whose small hand clenched tightly around her cup. She didn't speak, but her body language spoke volumes. "I see," Michael said, his tone friendly, but his eyes sharp. "Well, you two stay safe out there. It's a lonely stretch of highway." The man nodded tersely, clearly eager to end the interaction. As Michael walked back to his seat, he saw flashing lights in the distance, their glow cutting through the twilight. Help had arrived. Michael's heart pounded as he prepared for what might come next. Whatever this was, it wasn't over yet. Shadows beneath the surface. The flashing lights of the police car painted streaks of blue and red across the quiet parking lot of the Ember Ridge Rest Stop. The hum of fluorescent lights outside the diner grew faint as a hush seemed to settle over the building. Inside, the tension grew palpable. Michael Harris, seated near the counter, watched as the squad car came to a halt just beyond the glass door. His every muscle was coiled, ready to spring into action. The man in the booth, whom Michael now knew to be the focal point of this unease, shifted slightly in his seat. His demeanor remained composed, but Michael caught the subtle tightening of his jaw and the fleeting glance toward the exit. He was calculating something, that much was clear. Across from him, the girl, small, fragile, and fidgeting in her oversized hoodie, seemed frozen, her wide eyes fixed on the approaching lights. Michael's heart pounded. He knew from experience that moments like these could spiral out of control in an instant. He forced himself to remain calm, steadying his breath as he prepared for whatever came next. The diner's bell jingled faintly as the door swung open, admitting a uniformed officer. Officer Jenna Morales was a woman of medium build, her dark hair pulled back into a tight bun. She scanned the room quickly, her sharp eyes lingering on Michael for a moment before moving to the odd pair in the booth. Michael rose slowly, catching her attention with a nod. She approached him, her hand resting lightly on the radio clipped to her belt. "Michael Harris?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Michael nodded, gesturing subtly toward the booth. That's them. The girl signaled twice. Open palm. Fingers spread. Classic distress gesture. She's tense, keeps avoiding eye contact with him. Something's not right. Jenna's expression hardened, her professional mask sliding into place. Stay here. Let me handle it. Michael wasn't one to back down from danger, but he understood the importance of letting law enforcement take the lead. He nodded, stepping back to give her space. Jenna approached the booth, her demeanor calm but authoritative. Evening, she said, her tone casual as she stopped by the table. Mind if I have a word? The man looked up, his face a practiced mask of confusion. Is there a problem, officer? Jenna's gaze shifted briefly to the girl, who stared down at her lap, her hands clenched tightly together. We got a call about a possible issue involving a child. Just need to make sure everything's okay. The man's expression flickered, just for a moment. A shadow of something dark crossed his face before he regained control. Of course. This is my niece, Zoe. We're traveling to visit family out of state. Nothing unusual here. Zoe's head jerked up slightly at the sound of her name, but she didn't speak. Her wide eyes darted to Jenna, then to Michael, who stood near the counter, watching the exchange like a hawk. Jenna crouched slightly to meet Zoe's eye level, her voice softening. Hey there, sweetie. You doing okay? Zoe hesitated, glancing at the man before nodding stiffly. Ah, yes, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man smiled, leaning back in his seat as if to reinforce his casual demeanor. See, she's fine. Just a long day of driving. But Jenna wasn't convinced. She noticed the way Zoe's small hands trembled and how her body remained rigid, as if bracing for something. Rising to her full height, Jenna turned her attention back to the man. Mind if I see some ID, sir? Standard procedure, you understand. His smile faltered slightly, but he reached into his pocket, pulling out a wallet. As he handed over his driver's license, Jenna's sharp eyes scanned his face, watching for any hint of deception. She took the ID, her expression unreadable as she studied it. Michael, still near the counter, shifted his weight slightly, his military instincts screaming at him to stay ready. He knew Jenna was doing her best to de-escalate, but the man's demeanor was too polished, too rehearsed. Michael had seen men like him before, calm on the surface but capable of snapping without warning. Jenna handed the ID back with a polite nod. Thank you, Mr. Davies. I'll just need to verify a few things. Can you stay put for a moment? Davies nodded, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed his growing unease. Jenna stepped away, pulling out her radio to request a background check. As she spoke softly into the device, Michael noticed Zoe glancing at him again, her eyes pleading. He gave her the slightest nod, hoping to convey reassurance. Moments later, another officer entered the diner, a tall man with a commanding presence. Officer Derek Samuels exchanged a brief word with Jenna before they both approached the booth again. The atmosphere in the diner grew heavier, the truckers now watching with open curiosity. Mr. Davies, Jenna began, her tone firm, we need to clarify a few things about your relationship with Zoe. Would you mind stepping outside with us for a quick conversation? Davies' composure cracked slightly, his smile tightening as his gaze flicked between the two officers. Is that really necessary? She's just a shy kid. All this attention is going to upset her. Jenna didn't flinch. We'll do our best to keep it brief. Davies sighed dramatically, his irritation clear. He stood, smoothing down his shirt, and gestured for Zoe to stay seated. I'll be right back, sweetheart. As Davies walked toward the door with the officers, Michael's focus remained on Zoe. She sat motionless, her hands gripping the edge of the table, her breathing shallow. Michael approached slowly, crouching beside her booth. Hey, he said softly, his voice steady and reassuring. You're safe now. The police are here to help. Zoe's lips trembled, her eyes welling with tears. She opened her mouth to speak but hesitated, glancing toward the door where Davies had disappeared. Michael leaned in slightly, his tone gentle but firm. "It's okay. You can tell me what's going on. I promise I won't let anything happen to you." For a long moment, Zoe was silent. Then, in a voice so quiet he had to strain to hear, she whispered, "He's not my uncle. He took me." Michael's blood ran cold. The weight of her words hit him like a sledgehammer. Everything he had suspected was true, and worse. Outside, the raised voices of the officers and Davies reached Michael's ears. He knew things were about to escalate. Turning back to Zoe, he gave her a reassuring nod. "Stay here," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "I'm going to make sure he doesn't hurt you ever again." As Michael rose, his mind sharpened into the same combat-ready focus he had relied on in countless missions. Whatever came next, he was prepared to face it. This wasn't just another roadside stop. It was a battlefield, and Zoe's safety was the mission. Signals in the silence. Michael Harris watched as Officer Jenna Morales stepped into the diner, the weight of authority radiating from her every step. Despite her composed exterior, Michael could see the alertness in her eyes, the calculated movements of someone trained to assess and act under pressure. He was familiar with that look. It was the look of someone who had faced chaos and learned to navigate it. Michael's gut churned as he glanced back at the booth where the girl sat across from the man she had called her uncle. Every movement, every word exchanged between them, screamed of imbalance and tension. The girl, small and fidgeting, looked like she wanted to disappear into her oversized hoodie. The man, calm and collected, appeared too calculated, his smile thin and insincere. Michael couldn't shake the thought that whatever facade the man had constructed, it was cracking. The officer approached Michael first, her voice low. "You the one who called?" "Yes," Michael replied, his tone steady. The girl made a distressed gesture twice, open palm, fingers spread. "She's scared. Something's off." Jenna nodded curtly, her expression hardening. "Describe what you saw." Michael relayed every detail he could recall. The subtle gestures, the girl's nervous glances, and the man's unnerving composure. Jenna's jaw tightened, and her eyes flicked toward the booth. "Stay here," she instructed before turning toward the odd pair. Her hand rested near her utility belt, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Michael. It wasn't threatening. It was ready. He appreciated her measured approach. She wasn't rushing in, but she wasn't hesitating either. Jenna stopped at the table, her presence casting a shadow over the scene. The man looked up, his expression carefully neutral. The girl's shoulders stiffened as if she sensed a shift in the atmosphere. "Good evening," Jenna said, her voice calm but commanding. "Mind if I have a word with you?" The man's expression faltered for a split second before the mask slid back into place. "Is there a problem, officer?" Jenna's gaze shifted briefly to the girl, then back to the man. "We received a report about a child who might be in distress. I just want to make sure everything's okay." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. This is my niece, Zoe. We're traveling to visit family out of state. She's shy around strangers." Jenna's eyes narrowed slightly. "May I see some identification?" "Sir." The man hesitated, his hand hovering near his pocket. "Sure," he said, pulling out a wallet and handing over his ID. Michael noticed the slight twitch of his fingers as he handed it over. Jenna examined the ID with practiced efficiency. "Thank you, Mr. Bradley. Can you step outside with me for a moment? It'll just take a minute." Michael could see the hesitation in the man's movements, the way his eyes darted briefly to the girl before he forced himself to nod. "Sure," he said, sliding out of the booth. "Zoe, stay here. I'll be right back." As Bradley followed Jenna to the door, Michael's focus shifted entirely to the girl. Her small hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. She was trying to be invisible, shrinking into herself as much as she could. Michael made his way to the booth, crouching slightly so he was at her eye level. "Zoe," he said softly, keeping his voice low and reassuring. "My name's Michael. I'm here to help. Are you okay? Her wide eyes flicked to his face, filled with uncertainty and fear. She didn't answer, her lips pressed tightly together. You're safe now, Michael continued. The officer is talking to him. You don't have to be afraid anymore. For a moment, it seemed like she wouldn't respond, but then her small voice broke the silence. He's not my uncle. Michael's stomach tightened. He nodded, keeping his expression calm despite the storm raging inside him. Okay, he said gently. Can you tell me anything else? How long have you been with him? Zoe glanced toward the door where the officer and Bradley had gone. He told me not to talk, she whispered, her voice trembling. He said, he'd hurt my mom if I did. Michael's fists clenched, but he kept his voice soft. Zoe, I promise you, he's not going to hurt your mom. The police are here, and they'll make sure you're both safe. Can you tell me where your mom is? Her gaze dropped to her lap, and she shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. I don't know. He took me from school. Michael's mind raced. This was worse than he had feared. He needed to get as much information as possible without scaring her further. It's okay, he said, his tone steady. You're brave for telling me this. Do you remember anything about where he took you? Anything at all? She hesitated, then nodded slightly. There was a blue house and a big truck. Michael filed away the details, his instincts screaming that time was running out. He needed to ensure the police acted swiftly. Outside, voices were rising. Michael turned toward the window just in time to see Bradley gesturing wildly, his composure unraveling under Jenna's firm questioning. Another officer had arrived, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, standing as backup. Bradley's voice carried through the glass. This is ridiculous. She's my niece. I don't have to explain myself to you. Jenna remained calm, her hand resting on her hip. Mr. Bradley, this is just a routine check. If everything is as you say, there won't be any problems. But Michael could see it, the subtle shift in Bradley's stance, the tension in his frame. The man was preparing to bolt. Michael turned back to Zoe, his voice urgent but calm. Stay right here, okay? Don't move until the officer comes back for you. She nodded, her tears still falling, and Michael rose to his full height, moving swiftly toward the door. He stepped outside just as Bradley took a step back, his hands clenched into fists. Sir, I need you to calm down, Jenna said firmly, her tone brooking no argument. Bradley sneered, his voice low and venomous. I've had enough of this. You have no right. Suddenly, he spun on his heel and bolted toward the parking lot. Jenna and the other officer reacted instantly, shouting for him to stop, but Michael was already moving. His military reflexes kicked in as he sprinted after Bradley, closing the distance in seconds. Bradley reached for the handle of a car, but before he could get the door open, Michael grabbed him, locking his arms behind his back with practiced precision. Bradley thrashed, shouting obscenities, but Michael held firm until the officers arrived to take over. As they cuffed Bradley and escorted him to the squad car, Michael turned back to the diner. Through the glass, he saw Zoe watching, her small face pressed against the window, a mixture of fear and relief in her eyes. He gave her a reassuring nod, silently vowing that this was far from over. Zoe wasn't just another child in distress. She was a life worth fighting for, and Michael wasn't going to stop until she was safe, unraveling the web. The sky above Ember Ridge Rest Stop deepened into a bruised purple as dusk surrendered to night. The flashing lights of the police cars illuminated the diner's windows, casting long, erratic shadows on the walls. Michael stood by one of the vehicles, his arms crossed, his jaw clenched. His heart still raced from tackling Bradley, the adrenaline from the chase still burning in his veins. But now, a heavier weight settled in his chest. Inside the diner, Zoe sat at the booth, still clutching her oversized hoodie, as if it were the only thing tethering her to the ground. Officer Jenna Morales knelt beside her, speaking softly. Zoe's responses were slow and measured, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael couldn't hear their conversation, but he didn't need to. He'd seen enough to know that whatever this girl had endured, it had left deep scars. "Michael," a voice called, breaking him from his thoughts. Officer Derek Samuels approached, his imposing frame blocking some of the flashing lights. His face was serious, but there was a hint of gratitude in his eyes. "Thanks for stepping in back there. We've got Bradley in custody for now, but this case is far from straightforward." Michael nodded, his arms still crossed. "What's the story? Did you get anything out of him?" Derek sighed, pulling out a small notebook from his pocket. "He's claiming he's her uncle, but the details aren't adding up. His ID checks out, but there's no record of guardianship, and his story about how he's traveling with Zoe keeps changing. First, they were heading to visit family. Then he said they were moving to a new city. He's slippery." Michael's gaze shifted to the diner, his eyes landing on Zoe. "She told me he's not her uncle. Said he took her from school." Derek's jaw tightened. "That's what Jenna's trying to confirm now. We've already sent her description and his info to surrounding precincts. If there's a missing child report, we'll know soon." Michael's fists clenched. The idea of Zoe sitting in that booth, terrified and alone, while Bradley wove lies was enough to make his blood boil. "What about him? Any priors?" "Not yet," Derek said, though his tone carried a note of suspicion. "But we're digging. Men like him usually have something in their past, a trail they think they've buried. We'll find it." The conversation paused as Jenna emerged from the diner, her face grave. She motioned for Derek to join her, and Michael followed instinctively, unwilling to let this case slip through the cracks. "She's starting to open up," Jenna said quietly, her voice tinged with both relief and urgency. "Zoe confirmed he isn't her uncle. She doesn't know his real name. He took her from school 2 days ago." 2 days, Derek repeated, the weight of those words sinking in. "That's a long time to be missing." "She mentioned a blue house and a big truck," Jenna continued. "She doesn't know where it was, but she remembers him stopping there before they hit the road. It's our only lead for now." Michael's mind worked quickly. Could be a secondary location, a place he was keeping her before he decided to move her somewhere else. Jenna nodded. "That's my guess too. I've got dispatch pulling property records in the area, cross-referencing anything that matches a blue house and a large vehicle. But it's a needle in a haystack." Michael frowned. "What about her family? Any way to trace her back home?" Jenna hesitated, her expression darkening. "That's the other issue. She doesn't know her mom's phone number or address. Just a first name, Danielle. No other details." The frustration in her voice was evident. It wasn't uncommon for young children to have limited knowledge of their parents' contact information, but it made the situation that much harder to untangle. Michael exhaled sharply, his mind racing. "Then we start with Bradley. He knows more than he's saying." "We'll interrogate him," Derek said. "But these guys are pros at playing innocent. We need more than suspicion if we're going to pin this on him." Michael's jaw tightened. "You let me talk to him." Derek raised an eyebrow. "You're not law enforcement, Harris. You know I can't let you." "Look," Michael interrupted, his voice firm but low. "I've seen men like him before, predators who think they're smarter than everyone else. He won't talk to you, but I can get under his skin. He doesn't know who I am, and I'll use that." Jenna and Derek exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Jenna nodded reluctantly. "You get 5 minutes, but we're monitoring everything." Michael didn't need more than that. He followed Derek toward the squad car where Bradley sat, his hands cuffed behind his back. The man's face was calm again, his earlier panic replaced with a smugness that made Michael's blood boil. "Mr. Bradley," Michael said, leaning against the car door casually. "You've had quite an evening." Bradley sneered. "I don't know what you think you're doing, soldier, but I have rights. This is harassment." Michael smiled coldly. "You're right. You do have rights, and you're going to need a good lawyer to make sure they're respected. But here's the thing. I don't care about your rights. I care about that little girl in there." Bradley's expression didn't waver, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "Zoe is my niece. This is a misunderstanding." Michael stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You can lie to the police. You can spin whatever story you want. But I see you for what you are, a coward preying on someone who can't fight back. And let me tell you something. Cowards like you always make mistakes." Bradley's mask cracked, his lips twitching into a scowl. "You don't know anything." Michael leaned in, his voice as cold as steel. "I know enough. I know you've got something to hide, and I'm going to make sure they find it. That girl in there, she's already talking. Every word she says digs your hole deeper." Bradley shifted uncomfortably, his composure slipping further. "She doesn't know anything. She's lying." Michael's eyes burned with intensity. "You're panicking, Bradley. That's good. It means you're scared. And you should be. Because if I were you, I'd start praying the cops find you first. You don't want her family to get to you before they do." For a moment, there was silence. Then Bradley's jaw clenched, and he turned his head away, refusing to meet Michael's gaze. Michael straightened, his point made. He didn't need Bradley to admit anything. His reaction had said it all. With a nod to Derek, Michael stepped back, letting the officers take over. As he walked toward the diner, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Bradley was cracking, and it was only a matter of time before the whole truth came out. Inside, Zoe looked up as Michael entered, her small frame still trembling. He crouched beside her again, his voice soft. "We're going to find your mom, Zoe. I promise." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time, there was a flicker of hope. For the first time that night, she nodded. Michael rose, his resolve hardening. The web around Zoe was starting to unravel, but he knew the fight was far from over. Whatever darkness had brought her here, he was ready to face it, and to bring her back to the light. The chase for truth. The night at Ember Ridge rest stop deepened into a quiet stillness, broken only by the faint hum of the vending machines and the soft chirp of crickets. Inside the diner, the tension was anything but calm. Michael Harris stood near the booth where Zoe sat, her small frame hunched over, her trembling hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only stable thing in her world. Across the parking lot, the flashing lights of the police cars reflected in the diner's glass windows, a visual reminder of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Michael had seen enough of these situations in his life to know they rarely resolved quickly or easily. The pieces were coming together, but the full picture of what had happened to Zoe, and why, remained frustratingly out of reach. Officer Jenna Morales re-entered the diner, her expression serious. She walked over to Michael, lowering her voice. "Bradley isn't talking. He's playing the victim card, claiming this is a misunderstanding. He's stonewalling us." Michael's jaw tightened. What about Zoe's description? The blue house. The truck. Jenna nodded, pulling out a small notebook. "We got dispatch running checks on property records within a 50-mile radius, but there are hundreds of blue houses and large vehicles in the area. Without more specific details, it's like finding a needle in a haystack." Michael glanced at Zoe, her face pale, her eyes distant. She hadn't spoken much since telling him that Bradley had taken her from school. She was clearly terrified, and her exhaustion was written in the way her small shoulders slumped under the weight of it all. "We need to jog her memory," Michael said. "There's something she knows, something that could narrow this down." Jenna hesitated. She's been through a lot. Pushing her too hard could backfire. Michael crouched beside the booth again, meeting Zoe's eyes. "Zoe," he said gently, his tone low and steady. "You're doing really well, okay? You're brave. But I need you to help us a little more. Can you remember anything else about the house where he took you? Anything you saw, heard, or smelled?" Zoe bit her lip, her small hands twisting in her lap. She looked down, her brows furrowing in concentration. "There was a sign," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "A sign," Michael prompted, leaning closer. "What kind of sign?" She hesitated, then nodded. "A white sign, with red letters. It was big, like a rectangle, and there were trees all around." Michael's mind raced. A white sign with red letters. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Did you see any words on the sign?" Jenna asked gently. Zoe shook her head, her curls bouncing slightly. I don't remember. But I saw a man there. He was yelling at Mr. Bradley." Michael and Jenna exchanged a glance. "What did he look like?" Michael asked. Zoe's voice grew softer, as if she feared the memory. "Big, with a beard. He was wearing a green shirt." Michael's pulse quickened. A witness, or at least someone who might know something. "Good, Zoe. That's really helpful," he said, his voice calm. "Do you remember anything else about him? Did he say anything?" Zoe hesitated again, then nodded. "He said, 'Stay out of my property.'" Michael straightened, turning to Jenna. "That's it. If Bradley trespassed on private land, there's a record. Someone would have filed a report." Jenna's face lit up with understanding. She pulled out her radio and began relaying the new information. "Dispatch, cross-reference property records for blue houses in the area with any recent trespassing complaints. Focus on locations with wooded surroundings." As Jenna coordinated with dispatch, Michael looked back at Zoe. "You're doing great, Zoe," he said softly. "We're going to find your mom. Just hold on a little longer." Her lips quivered, but she managed a small nod. The faintest glimmer of trust shone in her tearful eyes, and Michael felt his resolve harden. They were closing in on the truth. It didn't take long for dispatch to call back. Jenna's radio crackled with a voice on the other end. "We got a match. Private property owned by Robert Hensley, about 30 miles east of the rest stop. Filed a trespassing complaint 2 days ago. Says a man driving a silver truck parked near his land and entered without permission. Hensley described the man as middle-aged, salt and pepper hair, wearing business attire." "That's our guy," Jenna muttered, turning to Michael. "Hensley's property matches Zoe's description. Blue house, wooded area, and a no trespassing sign in red and white." Michael nodded. "Let's go." Michael insisted on riding along with Jenna and Derek as they drove to Hensley's property. The cruiser sped down the darkened highway, its sirens cutting through the night. Michael sat in the back seat, his fingers tapping anxiously against his knee. "Tell me about Hensley," he said. Derek glanced at Jenna, then back at Michael. "Retired logger. Lives alone. Keeps to himself. The trespassing report mentioned he was armed, so we'll need to approach carefully." Michael nodded, already running scenarios through his head. If Bradley had been at Hensley's property, there was a chance he'd left something behind. Evidence, or even a connection to other crimes. Men like him rarely acted alone. As they approached the property, the cruiser's headlights illuminated the white and red no trespassing sign Zoe had described. Beyond it, a narrow dirt path led to a modest blue house surrounded by tall pines. The windows glowed faintly with warm light. The officers exited the vehicle, their hands resting on their holsters. Michael followed, staying a step behind as they approached the house. Jenna knocked firmly on the wooden door. It swung open a moment later to reveal a tall man with a grizzled beard and a weary expression. He wore a faded green shirt, just as Zoe had described. "Robert Hensley?" Jenna asked, holding up her badge. Hensley's eyes narrowed. "What's this about?" "We're investigating a potential child abduction," Jenna said. "You filed a trespassing complaint 2 days ago about a man matching this description." She handed him a photo of Bradley. Hensley's face darkened. "Yeah, that's the guy. Showed up on my land, acting all shady. Told him to get lost." "Did he say anything?" Michael interjected, stepping forward. "Did you see a little girl with him?" Hensley's gaze flicked to Michael, then back to the officers. "Didn't see a girl. But he was acting jumpy, kept looking over his shoulder like he was hiding something. "Do you know where he might have gone?" Jenna asked. Hensley scratched his beard thoughtfully. "He drove off toward the old mill. That place has been abandoned for years. Locals say it's where troublemakers like him go to hide." Michael's blood ran cold. "The old mill," he repeated. "How far is it?" "About 5 miles, Hensley said. "Take the back road past the creek. You can't miss it." Jenna nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Hensley." As the cruiser sped toward the mill, Michael's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was darker than he had anticipated. The old mill was remote, the perfect place for someone like Bradley to hide, or worse, to plan his next move. They had to act fast. The clock was ticking, and Zoe's safety, and perhaps the safety of others, depended on what they found next. The chase for truth was far from over. The shadows of the mill. The cruiser's tires crunched over gravel as it approached the old mill, a hulking structure that loomed against the darkened sky like a forgotten sentinel. Rusted metal beams and weathered wooden walls bore the weight of decades of decay, the building a relic of an industrial past that now served as a haven for secrecy and danger. The faint scent of damp earth and oil hung in the air, carried by a chilling breeze. Michael Harris stepped out of the car, his boots landing softly on the gravel. Beside him, officers Jenna Morales and Derek Samuels scanned the area with flashlights, their beams cutting through the dense shadows. The mill was eerily quiet, its silence unnerving. Michael's instincts were on high alert, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling with the sense that they were being watched. "This place gives me the creeps," Jenna muttered, her flashlight swinging toward a set of broken windows on the second floor. Derek nodded, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered weapon. "If Bradley's been here, he's long gone. But we might find something. Evidence, clues. We need to tread carefully." Michael's gaze swept the area, his sharp eyes catching every detail. A discarded can of soda lay near the mill's entrance, its label faded but not weathered enough to suggest it had been there long. Nearby, tire tracks cut through the dirt, leading toward the back of the building. He crouched to examine them. "Fresh," he said, his voice low. "Maybe a day old." Jenna joined him, shining her flashlight over the tracks. "Bradley's truck." "Possibly," Michael replied, standing and dusting his hands off. "Let's see where they lead." The trio moved cautiously toward the rear of the mill, the gravel shifting underfoot. As they rounded the corner, Michael's eyes locked onto a rusted door slightly ajar, its hinges bent from years of neglect. He motioned for the officers to stop, his hand raised for silence. The faintest sound reached his ears, a muffled rustle, followed by a low creak. Someone was inside. Jenna and Derek exchanged a glance, their weapons drawn now. Michael, unarmed but far from helpless, positioned himself just behind them, ready to act if necessary. Jenna took the lead, pushing the door open with her shoulder, the groan of metal against metal echoing through the night. The interior of the mill was a maze of shadows and forgotten machinery. Dust motes danced in the beams of their flashlights, the air thick with the smell of rust and mildew. Broken conveyor belts hung limply from the ceiling, and piles of debris littered the floor. The sound of dripping water punctuated the silence, a slow, steady rhythm that only heightened the tension. Michael's eyes scanned the space, his military training kicking in. He moved with practiced precision, his steps silent as he advanced deeper into the mill. The officers followed, their lights casting eerie shapes on the walls. Then they saw it, a small makeshift camp tucked into a corner of the mill. A tattered sleeping bag lay on the floor, surrounded by scattered food wrappers and empty water bottles. A propane lantern flickered dimly, casting a weak circle of light over the scene. "This is it," Derek whispered, his voice barely audible. "Bradley's been here." Michael moved closer, his gaze falling on a notebook lying partially open on the sleeping bag. He reached for it carefully, his gloved fingers flipping through its pages. The handwriting was cramped and uneven, the entries fragmented but telling. Picked her up. No one noticed. Have to keep moving. She won't stop crying. Told her to be quiet. Threatened her mom. Worked. Saw someone at the rest stop. Might have been watching. Can't risk staying here much longer. Michael's grip tightened on the notebook. The entries confirmed what he had suspected. Zoe's abduction was calculated, and Bradley had been planning to move her again. Over here, Jenna called softly, drawing their attention. She stood near a stack of crates, her flashlight trained on a small object partially hidden beneath them. Michael and Derek joined her, their hearts sinking as they realized what it was: a child's backpack, pink and decorated with cartoon characters. Michael picked it up, his jaw tightening as he recognized the initials stitched onto the fabric. Zevo. It's hers, Michael said grimly, passing the backpack to Jenna. He was keeping her here. But where is he now? Derek asked, his eyes scanning the shadows. Before anyone could respond, a faint noise echoed from deeper within the mill, a shuffling sound, like footsteps on concrete. All three froze, their bodies tense as they strained to listen. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the faint scrape of something metallic. Jenna motioned for them to follow, her weapon raised as she moved toward the source of the noise. They crept through the mill's labyrinthine interior, their footsteps muffled by the dust-covered floor. The sound led them to a stairwell, its rusted metal steps spiraling upward into the darkness. Upstairs, Jenna whispered, her voice tight with tension. Michael nodded, taking the lead despite his lack of a weapon. His hands were steady, his movements deliberate as he ascended the stairs. Each creak of the metal seemed deafening in the silence, but he pressed on, his focus unwavering. At the top of the stairs, they found themselves in a large open room filled with more machinery and debris. The noise was louder now, coming from behind a set of large pipes near the far wall. Michael moved toward it cautiously, his senses on high alert. As he rounded the corner, his eyes locked onto a figure crouched near the pipes, a man with disheveled hair and wild eyes, clutching a metal wrench. It wasn't Bradley, but the man's erratic movements and muttered words made it clear he wasn't in his right mind. "Drop the wrench," Jenna commanded, her voice firm and steady. The man whipped around, his eyes wide with panic. "I didn't do anything," he shouted, his grip tightening on the wrench. "I don't know anything." "Put it down," Derek ordered, stepping closer. "We just want to talk." The man hesitated, his gaze darting between them. Finally, he let the wrench clatter to the floor, raising his hands in surrender. Michael stepped forward. "Who are you? Why are you here?" The man licked his lips nervously. "Name's Danny. I come here sometimes. For shelter. I didn't hurt anyone, I swear." Michael's eyes narrowed. "Did you see a man here recently?" Middle-aged, salt and pepper hair, driving a silver truck. Danny nodded quickly, his movements jittery. Yeah. He was here. Had a little girl with him. I told him to leave. Said this was my spot." "Where did he go?" Jenna demanded. Danny pointed toward a broken window overlooking the woods. "Out that way. He said he had another place, a cabin or something." Michael's heart sank. Bradley was still one step ahead of them, but at least now they had a direction. "Which way?" Michael pressed. Danny hesitated, then pointed east, through the woods. "It's about 2 miles from here, near the creek." Jenna nodded, signaling for Derek to secure Danny. Michael's mind was already racing. They had a lead, and time was running out. Zoe's life, and perhaps the lives of others, depended on what they did next. The shadows of the mill had given up one of their secrets. Now Michael and the officers had to face whatever awaited them in the deeper darkness ahead. Rescue in the woods. The wind whispered through the dark woods as Michael Harris and officers Jenna Morales and Derek Samuels moved silently among the towering trees. Their breaths were steady, their senses heightened, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. The faint glow of their flashlights illuminated the uneven path ahead, casting long shadows that danced like specters. Danny's directions had led them into the dense forest beyond the mill. Somewhere ahead, Bradley's so-called cabin waited, its secrets hidden beneath the canopy of trees. Michael's mind raced with possibilities, his instincts honed by years of military service. Bradley was desperate now, likely realizing his carefully constructed facade was crumbling. The cornered man was dangerous, and Michael knew they had to act swiftly and decisively. "This way," Jenna whispered, her voice barely audible as she pointed to a faint trail in the underbrush. The soft crunch of leaves underfoot was the only sound as they moved forward, their lights scanning the darkness. Michael's sharp eyes caught something glinting in the beam of his flashlight, a piece of fabric snagged on a low branch. He knelt to inspect it, recognizing the bright red hue immediately. "Zoe's hoodie. She's been here," he said, rising and showing the fragment to Jenna and Derek. His voice was low but firm. "We're close." Jenna's jaw tightened. "Stay sharp. If he knows we're coming, this could get messy." The trail led to a clearing where the cabin stood, a decrepit structure barely visible against the shadows of the trees. The moonlight filtered through the branches, casting eerie patterns across its weathered walls. The cabin's windows were dark, but a faint flicker of light escaped from the edges of the door, betraying signs of life inside. Michael's heart pounded as he crouched near a cluster of bushes, his body tense and ready. Jenna and Derek flanked him, their weapons drawn, their faces set with grim determination. "We go in quiet," Jenna whispered, her eyes locking with Michael's. "We don't want to spook him." Michael nodded, his pulse steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "If Zoe's in there, we move fast. He won't have time to react." Derek gave a curt nod. "I'll take the back entrance. You two take the front. Watch your corners." As Derek disappeared into the shadows, Michael and Jenna crept toward the cabin's front door. The faint creak of wood under their boots was the only sound, each step measured and deliberate. Michael pressed his ear to the door, listening for any movement inside. He could hear muffled voices, Bradley's low, controlled tone, and a softer, trembling response that could only be Zoe's. He exchanged a glance with Jenna, his jaw tightening. "She's in there," he mouthed. Jenna nodded, signaling with her fingers. "On 3. Michael gripped the door handle, his body coiled like a spring. Jenna raised her weapon, her posture steady. She began the silent countdown with her fingers. 3, 2, 1. Michael pushed the door open with controlled force, stepping inside with Jenna close behind. The cabin's interior was cramped and dimly lit, the faint glow of a lantern casting flickering shadows on the walls. Bradley was seated at a small table, his back to the door. Zoe sat across from him, her hands tied in front of her, her eyes wide with fear. "Police, don't move," Jenna shouted, her weapon trained on Bradley. Bradley froze, his hand hovering near a hunting knife lying on the table. Slowly, he turned to face them, his expression a mask of surprise and defiance. "This is a mistake," he said smoothly, his voice low and steady. "You don't understand. Hands where I can see them." Jenna barked, cutting him off. Bradley's eyes darted to Zoe, then to the knife. Michael saw the flicker of desperation in his gaze and acted before Bradley could make his move. In one swift motion, Michael lunged forward, slamming Bradley's hand away from the blade and pinning him against the wall. Bradley struggled, his face twisting in rage. "You don't know what you're doing," he snarled, but Michael's grip didn't falter. "Stay down," Michael growled, his voice calm but deadly. "It's over." Jenna moved quickly to secure Bradley, slapping handcuffs onto his wrists as Derek burst through the back door, his weapon drawn. With Bradley restrained, Michael turned his attention to Zoe. She flinched as he approached, her body trembling, but her wide eyes softened when she recognized him. "Zoe," Michael said gently, kneeling beside her. "It's me, Michael. You're safe now." Her lip quivered, tears streaming down her cheeks as she nodded. Michael reached for the rope binding her wrists, cutting it with a swift motion of his knife. As the rope fell away, Zoe threw her arms around him, her small body shaking with sobs. "It's okay," Michael murmured, his voice soft and steady. "He can't hurt you anymore." Outside the cabin, the tension began to ease as backup arrived, the flashing lights of additional police cars casting the woods in an otherworldly glow. Bradley was led away in handcuffs, his protests falling on deaf ears. Derek and Jenna coordinated with the arriving officers, ensuring every detail was documented. Michael sat on the back bumper of an ambulance, holding Zoe close as a paramedic checked her over. She clung to him tightly, her small hands gripping his shirt, as if letting go would bring the nightmare rushing back. "You did good, Zoe," Michael said softly. "You were brave." She looked up at him, her tear-streaked face etched with exhaustion and relief. "You came for me," she whispered. Michael smiled faintly, his voice steady. "I told you I wouldn't let anything happen to you." Jenna approached, her expression softening as she saw Zoe nestled against Michael. "We've contacted child services," she said quietly. "They'll take care of her until we locate her mother." Michael nodded but said nothing. His focus remained on Zoe, her breathing slow and steady now as she began to relax. The drive back to the rest stop was quieter, the chaos of the night giving way to a calm that felt almost surreal. Zoe fell asleep in the back seat, her small frame curled up under a blanket. Michael sat beside her, his mind replaying every moment of the rescue. "You did good out there," Jenna said from the driver's seat, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. Michael met her gaze briefly. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us." Jenna nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Still, you stepped up when it mattered. That girl's alive because of you." Michael looked down at Zoe, her peaceful expression a stark contrast to the fear he had seen earlier. He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "She's got a lot of healing ahead of her," Michael said quietly. "But she's strong. She'll get through it." As the rest stop came into view, bathed in the soft glow of its fluorescent lights, Michael felt a sense of closure. The battle wasn't over. There would be questions, investigations, and trials. But Zoe was safe. And that was enough for now. For the first time in years, Michael allowed himself to feel something he rarely indulged in: hope.